Hello, hello. We're going to get started in a couple minutes. Dr. Ziegler still on her way. It's a different clock in Israel, so. Just lost someone. Hi, Dr. Ziegler. Welcome.
Hi, how are you? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, we got a few people joining. We'll start in just a minute. We'll just give it one more minute. We've got some stragglers. What time is it there in Israel?
8 o'clock.
8 o'clock. Okay, not too crazy. That's why we do these earlier in the day, not at 8 o'clock our time.
Yeah. How's the weather in Chicago?
Um, it's chilly, but could be worse.
It's
Everyone
not
agree with
really
that?
very cold
Oh,
for
okay. I'm not
December
from
in
Chicago,
Chicago.
so
Neither am I, but I'm from Canada.
yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Okay.
The weather is can't complain.
Okay. As soon as these two log on, we're gonna get started. Okay. We are really excited that we're all here with Dr. Ziegler. This is a part of a continuing series we've been doing of learning from Eretz Yisrael and getting to hear Torah, even amidst the time of pain and of conflict and of fear. We are so grateful to be receiving words of wisdom, chizuk, and just good Torah from Eretz Yisrael. And we're really, really grateful to Dr. Ziegler for being willing to share that. This session, just to let everyone know, is sponsored by the person who's logging on right now, by the Siegel family. Sponsored by the Siegel family in memory of Dr. Paul S. Friedman, and in gratitude the Skokie Valley community on the 1-year anniversary of their membership. So we want to thank Nehemia, who's with us, and Margalit. And if you'd like to sponsor the session next week with Judy Klitzner, please email the office. We'd love to have you. So Dr. Yael Ziegler teaches at Matan, and she's an assistant professor of Bible at Herzog College, Michael at Herzog. Her books include Ruth, From Alienation to Monarchy, and Promises to Keep, the Oath in the Biblical Narrative, and a book on Eicha and Lamentations, Faith in a Turbulent World. Dr. Ziegler lectures widely in shuls and on campuses and on 5 different continents, not on Antarctica yet, has served as a scholar in residence, and perhaps most importantly is the sister of our community member, Dr. Malka Simkovich. We're so happy to learn from you.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to just share my screen. Okay, there you go. You can see it?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right. So on this crowded opening screen, we have lots and lots of Tehillim, which we won't say together, but they're there to express our tefillot. And of course, we will be dedicating this shiur, as we dedicate all shiurim in the past 2 months, to the success of our chayalim. I personally have 4 chayalim in memory of the chalalim, for the return of the shvuim, and the refuah of all of the wounded. We also, I like to open with the tefillah that is for all of these different parts that we are praying for. We won't say the tefillah together, but once again, I've put it on the screen. We're going to be talking today about Hanukkah. I think we'll have some very relevant messages with regard to some of the contemporary and current events that we're going through. But mainly we're really going to be focusing on Hanukkah and the messages of the holiday itself. Now, I teach Tanakh. I'm a Tanakh teacher. And for, much of my life, I've been saying, well, there's really nothing to teach about Hanukkah in the Tanakh, which is more or less true, because, of course, Hanukkah is a holiday from 164 BCE, and that's pretty much after all of the Tanakh books. The books that we have that really discuss Hanukkah are the apocryphal books, right? 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees. These are books that were not canonized. And the reason that they weren't canonized is pretty simple, because books were only canonized if they were thought to have been said with prophetic inspiration, and prophecy is no longer at the time of Hanukkah. So the books that are written after the story of Hanukkah, 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees, 1 Maccabees is a very biblical-like book. It feels very biblical in its writing. It was composed originally in Hebrew. Still, it was not canonized as part of the Tanakh. So we will not be so we won't be talking too much about 1 Maccabees, but a little bit we will talk about, because that really is the story of Hanukkah. And yet, even though Hanukkah does not appear in the Tanakh, actually we do seem to have a little bit of clues, or several clues about Hanukkah when it comes to some of the books from the period of Shivat Zion, namely the books of Haggai and Zechariah. Now, these are not books that people are particularly familiar with. They're kind of buried at the very end of Sefer Treasar, of that, the book of the 12 kind of short prophecies. But these are really very significant books for many, many reasons, not the least of which is that both Haggai and Zechariah pretty much have one mission, and that mission is successful. Somehow I feel like I need to repeat that statement. They are successful prophets. Why do I have to repeat that statement? Because I think that a lot of people assume that the prophets were pretty much, failures. I mean, that sounds a little harsh, but I mean, in terms of they made this great effort to prophesy to the people, to try to get the people to repent, to try to get the people to wake up and properly serve God. And for the most part, they were unsuccessful. But Haggai and Zechariah are extremely successful in their particular message, because their message is that the people who have come back from Bavel, who have come back from Babylon after the period of the exile, need to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. Okay, and that actually happens. I'm going to share with you a little bit of the timeline, just so that we have a little bit of a recap of this period. The period, of course, is set in motion by the exile itself. So I brought for you the first date, which is 586 BCE. That is the year that the temple was actually destroyed, and the rest of the Judean people living in Yerushalayim, living in the area of Yehuda, they were sent into exile. Now, they're actually in exile for less than 50 years. I mean, some of the Judeans already went into exile a little bit earlier, but actually those people who go into exile in 586 BCE are able to return back to the land of Israel after Cyrus makes his proclamation in 539 BCE. Cyrus, of course, is a Persian king, right? He's no longer from the Babylonian Empire, and he famously makes this proclamation allowing not just the people of Yehuda, but actually all of the peoples in his kingdom. He allows them to go back to their original land and rebuild their temple. And that's, of course, what happens. The Judeans don't go back en masse, but a small group of exiles from Yehuda actually return to Yerushalayim in 539 BCE. When I say a small group, actually we're talking about 42,000 people. That's not a very large group. We know that from the book of Ezra. And they do go back to Yerushalayim. And right away, they begin to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. They lay the foundations. And of course, there are all of these enemies around, all of these hostile people in Jerusalem. And these people write a letter to Cyrus and say, it's not a good idea to let these Judeans, who are rather subversive group, it's not a good idea to allow them to rebuild the temple because really they want to rebel. And so the temple building project is stopped in 539 BC. In the meantime, the people are in not such an amazing situation economically, militarily, politically, in terms of security. The people are not really thriving in Yehuda. And this leads to the prophecies of Haggai and Zechariah. 19 years after the people return from exile, 19 years after the Cyrus proclamation, Haggai and Zechariah prophesy to this group of people living in Yehuda and tell them, now is the time to build the Beit HaMikdash. And in fact, as I said, Haggai and Zechariah are extraordinarily successful. The people actually do get it together and they rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. It takes them 4 years. They purposefully seem to time the building of the second Beit HaMikdash with that 70-year period. And so the second temple is built in 516 BCE, exactly 70 years after the temple was destroyed. So this is kind of the backdrop of the story of Shivat Zion. And yet, I said that I think that there are certain clues in Haggai and Zechariah that hint to the fact that we are going to have this holiday of Hanukkah. But just to give you a little bit of perspective, we are talking about events that are not going to take place for another 350 years. Okay, the temple that is rededicated by the Maccabim is a story that takes place in 164 BCE. That's the story of Hanukkah. And the question is what does that have to do with Haggai and Zechariah? So I'm going to start by saying, first of all, I think we know that there's some kind of connection between Haggai and Zechariah and the story of Hanukkah by the very fact that on Shabbat we are going to read, and we always read on Shabbat Hanukkah for the Haftarah. This year, I believe we have 2 Shabbatot, so we have 2 different Haftarahs, but usually there's 1 Shabbat Hanukkah. And what do we read for the Haftarah? We read from Zechariah Perek Daled. We're going to talk about that a little bit soon. That's, of course, his vision of the menorah, his vision of the menorah in the Mikdash. And so there does seem to be already a hint that there's some kind of connection between the book of Zechariah, who is prophesying events that take place in 520 BCE, and the later story of the Maccabees, which takes place over 350 years later. But I think that there's another clue in the book of Haggai that we're meant to actually already feel that Hanukkah is hinted to in the Tanakh itself. And that is that in the second chapter of the book of Haggai, the book of Haggai is a very, very short book. It's only 2 chapters long, and it consists of 4 separate prophecies, each of which is given a particular date, right? Haggai is very into dates. His first prophecy is said on Aleph Elul. That seems to be a significant date, right? The first day that we start saying, L'David Hashem Ori V'ishi, that means more in Tehillim. It's, of course, the day that we kind of launch the tshuva process every year. His second prophecy is said on Hoshana Rabbah, which seems to be the end of this tshuva period. And his third prophecy, I've brought it for you here, is said Be'esrim ve'arba'a latchi'i, on the 24th day of Kislev. Now, that's an interesting date. It's not exactly Hanukkah, but both the third prophecy and the fourth prophecy are said on the day before Hanukkah. And what's interesting about this prophecy is that if you look at the prophecy itself, Haggai, who is speaking on the day before Hanukkah, says as follows. He says, look where my cursor is on Pasuk Tedvav, V'ata simu na levavchem min hayom hazeh v'mala. I want you to pay attention from this day forward, miterem sum even el even be'echal Hashem, before they have begun to build and to place stones one upon the other in the temple. In other words, what is Haggai saying? He is prophesying on the day before Hanukkah and saying, as of tomorrow, when you begin building the temple, everything is going to change. And that's kind of an extraordinary clue, right? Because that suggests that in the time of Haggai and Zechariah, what day did they actually start rebuilding the second temple? They started rebuilding that second temple on Hanukkah, okay? And that is a really interesting observation. It's not my observation. It actually is an observation of a teacher of mine, Rav Yael bin Nun from Michal Herzog, who wrote an article about this and said, as soon as I noticed this, I looked all over the Parshanim and I couldn't find any of the ancient or medieval Parshanim who had paid attention to this. He did find several Hasidic thinkers who seem to have noted this as well. But this is really an extraordinary hint. And we want to ask ourselves, I think, what is the connection between Haggai and Zechariah and Hanukkah, which takes place 350 years later? So I want to start by noting that Haggai prophesies some very basic prophecies, like, go up to the mountain and cut down a tree and start building, and don't worry about the grandeur of the temple, right? He really says some, I think, very basic things. Just cut down a tree, start building, and your economic situation is bound to change. And the people do listen to that. But at the same time, Haggai has several rather far-reaching prophecies that don't seem to have come true. And this is an exegetical problem that a lot of the Parshanim are going to relate to. So look, for example, in this prophecy in Haggai, Perek Bet, the second chapter in Haggai, he says as follows, Ki cho amar Hashem tzvaot, od echad me'ati va'ani mar'ish et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. Very soon I am going to overturn the heavens and the earth and the yam and the charava, the seas and the dry land. And look at what he says in this part that I've put in blue, starting in Pasuk Tet. He promises them, he says to them, I know you're looking now at this project of building the temple and you're feeling that it is inadequate compared to the first temple. But he says, I am prophesying to you, Gadol yeh kevod habayit hazeh ha'acharon min harishon. The second temple is going to be even greater than the first temple. Amar Hashem tzvaot, uvemakom hazeh etein shalom. And in this place, I'm going to make peace. Now, this is a very difficult prophecy to reconcile with what actually seems to happen, certainly during the period of Haggai. And we'll see in a few minutes, some of the Parshanim, some of the exegetes are going to have to relate to the question of, does this happen? When does it happen? There's another prophecy of Haggai that also seems to be rather eschatological in nature. It seems to be rather far-reaching. He tells them again, "Vayi dvar Hashem shenit el Haggai be'esrim v'arba chodesh leimor." Right, Haggai that gets this second prophecy on the 24th day of Kislev, and in this prophecy, he speaks to the political leader whose name is Zerubbabel. He is a descendant of the Davidic dynasty. And Haggai says to him in the name of God, Ani mar'ish et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. Again, I am going to make the heavens and the earth quake. Ve'hafachti kisei mamlachot. I'm going to overturn the throne of all of these different kingdoms. V'hishmadeti chozek mamlachot hagoyim. I'm going to destroy the strength of all of these nations, right? And once again, it seems that during Haggai's period, this does not take place. In other words, Haggai and Zechariah are telling the people of Yehuda to rebuild the Mikdash during a time when they are under the jurisdiction of the great Persian Empire. There is no overturning of the Persian Empire during Chagai and Malachi's time. There's no grand Beit HaMikdash. There's no exquisite building that even comes close to the first temple, let alone, it seems to be grander than the first temple. So we have several prophecies during this period of Chagai's prophecies that seem to be rather problematic. And I think that the first thing that we have to suggest is that the Maccabees regard themselves as the fulfillment of these prophecies, right? The Maccabees themselves seem to time their dedication of the temple with the date of Chagai's prophecy, with the date in which they started building the Beit HaMikdash, in order to, I think, make it clear to everyone around, we are the ones who are coming in order to actualize the prophecies of Chagai that didn't actually take place in his time. Indeed, it's 350 years later, but it's still the period of Shivat Zion. And so the Maccabees come in and say, remember when Chagai said that the second Beit HaMikdash is going to be even greater and grander than the first? We're going to do that. And remember when Chagai said he is going to overturn these great kingdoms, these great empires? Well, we are going to come in and do that. And remember when Chagai said that you are going to have autonomy and you are going to rule yourselves? It hasn't happened yet, but the Maccabees say we're going to do that. And that's why in the book of Maccabees, when they win the battles, right? When they force Antiochus's armies to go back and to leave Yehuda HaMaccabee, and we always think, I think a lot of people think that the reason that we celebrate Kaf Hei Kislev is because that's the day that they won their great military victory. And that is not true. That's not true according to the book of Maccabees. After they won their great victory, Yehuda speaks to all of the people of the nation, and he says to them, Hein ha'oyev nigaf lefanenu. Our enemy has been defeated. Let us go and purify the temple. And they go up to the Temple Mount, and they see that the temple is desolate, and they see that the grass has overgrown the area of the temple, and they see that the altar has been smashed, and they tear their clothes, and they enter into a state of mourning, and Yehuda says, let's rebuild. And they start rebuilding. They rebuild the structure, and they rebuild the vessels, and they rebuild the altar. This is not an event that takes place in one day. This is an event that takes place over the course of several weeks, perhaps even several months. And so the timing of rededicating the Mikdash on the 25th day of Kislev is very deliberate timing. And what I'm suggesting is that timing was designed to coincide with the day that they started building the temple, as if to say, we are now the ones who are properly actualizing the prophecies of Chagai, of that period of Shivat Zion. They never came true until now. It is 350 years later, and now finally we have the opportunity. We have the opportunity to build the Mikdash, to make it grander, to become autonomous in our land, to overthrow these terrible empires. Of course, the empire at this point is no longer the Persian Empire. We moved on to the Greek Seleucid Empire, but still we now have the occasion to actualize this idea that God promises that we will have the strength, we will have the support to overturn his empire. Now, just for intellectual honesty's sake, I want to mention that there is another reason that Yehuda HaMaccabee times the rededication of the temple with the 25th of Kislev, and that is that in the first chapter of the book of 1 Maccabees, we have the description of the terrible decrees, the anti-religious Hellenizing decrees of Antiochus against Yerushalayim. Of course, he tells the people, you can't circumcise, you can't keep Shabbat. And he also tells them, you can no longer bring your daily sacrifices. You can no longer bring the sacrifices that you're accustomed to bringing in the Mikdash. On the 15th day of Kislev, this is 3 years before the events that we're reading about here on the screen, in 167 BCE, on the 15th day of Kislev, Antiochus's men went into the Mikdash and set up an idol. And on the 25th day of Kislev, they started bringing their pagan sacrifices in the Mikdash. And I don't think that that's a coincidence either. I think that they choose that date because that is the day that was known to be the day that the Judeans began building the second temple. And so what we have here, I think, is a significant date in the book of Maccabees, the 25th day of Kislev, which appears twice, both in the Hellenizing attempt to get rid of proper worship in the Mikdash, and in the Maccabees attempt to purify and rededicate the Mikdash to service of God. Both of these things take place on the very significant date in which Haggai and Zechariah had the people beginning the building of the Mikdash. Now, this point, I think, this idea that the prophecies of Haggai that don't seem to take place during his time period, the idea that the Maccabees are the ones who are going to actualize those prophecies, actually, that idea does appear among some of the medieval exegetes. As I said, all of the different exegetes have to ask the question, what happened to Haggai's great eschatological prophecy? I'm going to overturn the kingdoms and I'm going to make the second temple greater than the first. So there are several different ways to go with this. One is the way of the Malbim and the Abarbanel, both of whom say, well, prophecy didn't take place in that time because the people weren't deserving. And so we're going to put that prophecy in a drawer and we're going to revisit that prophecy at the end of days. One day that prophecy will come true. That's one approach. The other approach is the approach of the Gemara, which seems to try to explain that actually the prophecies of Haggai did take place during his time, even if it's not sitting so comfortably with us. In other words, when Haggai said that the second temple will be greater than the first temple, it'll be taller. It means it'll be a little bigger. And indeed, it was a little bigger, it was a little taller. So maybe they did take place. But the third approach of the exegetes, I think, really matches what we are saying, which is, look at what the Radak says. The Radak actually brings several different approaches. And one of the things that he says is, Yesh omrim shezeh haya bimei Hashmonaim. Some people say that this prophecy took place during the days of the Hashmonaim. Rashi says the same thing. And as for the second prophecy of Haggai that doesn't seem to take place, which is even more, I think, clearly actualized during the period of the Maccabees, who really seemed to witness the overturning of this extraordinarily successful Greek empire, right? As for that prophecy, once again, we have some of the medieval Parshanim saying, well, this prophecy does take place with the story of the Maccabees when the Bnei Hashmonaim kamu al hayevanim v'haragum, when the Hashmonaim got up against the Greeks and killed those Greeks. So it seems to me, and I think that this is actually a really intriguing reading, that the Maccabees, when they were going out and dedicating the Mikdash, and even in other things that they were doing as well, in their efforts, they saw themselves as those people who are fulfilling Haggai's prophecies. Haggai said that this is going to happen. We're going to make it happen. We're going to shake up this great kingdom. We are going to pull out from under the yoke of the Greek Empire. We are going to become autonomous. We are going to rededicate the Mikdash. We are going to make it grand. We are going to achieve all of these different military victories. And look at that, it was accomplished. The only problem with this approach is, and I think it is really a problem, is that, I don't know, it's a real question why we celebrate Hanukkah. Because the Maccabees are successful for like a really short period. I mean, they continue being autonomous, but we know what happens with their leadership, right? It becomes corrupt, it becomes perverse, it becomes filled with civil war. It no longer seems to really be dedicated to service of God. And ultimately, of course, it really turns into a catastrophic failure. So why are we celebrating Hanukkah, right? What is it that we're celebrating here? Now, possibly it's a Dayenu moment, right? In other words, when we sing the song Dayenu, we say, well, if you had just taken us out of Egypt, but not allowed us to cross the sea, that would have been enough for us to celebrate. Which again, I mean, every time I sing the song, I always say, really? If you had taken us across the sea, but you hadn't given us the man, that would have been enough. But then we would have starved. Okay, but there still are stages here in which we are meant to recognize God's intervention, God's miracles, God's ability and willingness to do things for us. One could certainly make that argument about the Maccabees, right? One could say this is a very significant moment. It creates a precedent. It teaches us how to obtain autonomy. It also teaches us what not to do in order not to lose it. We should definitely implement some of those lessons, right? But also, I think it's telling us that great things can happen. Great things can happen in stunning ways. And so maybe that's what they're celebrating. Maybe that's what we're celebrating, right? We're celebrating the possibility of overturning kingdoms, the possibility of reinstating some of our past glories and even surpassing them. Maybe that's what we're celebrating. But to really understand, I think, what we're celebrating, I want to turn to the only Gemara which talks about Hanukkah, right? There's been a tremendous amount of discussion of this fact that there is one very, very brief section in one Gemara that addresses Hanukkah, and it really does so rather peripherally. It's a tangent to a different discussion about Hadlakat Nerot of Shabbat. It appears in Masechet Shabbat. But the question that the Gemara asks, I think, is the question that we're asking. My Chanukah, which I'm going to sort of rephrase a little bit or paraphrase a little bit. Why are we celebrating Hanukkah, right? And the answer of the Gemara, I think this is a pretty well-known problem, is somewhat surprising, right? When you look at the Gemara, or before you look at the Gemara, and you ask yourself, why are we celebrating Hanukkah? If I were in a classroom with you, I would ask you, why are we celebrating Hanukkah? Well, we had a tremendous military victory. Well, we rededicated the temple. We saw the possibility of achieving victory in a war of the few against the many, in a war of the less powerful against the more powerful, right? We saw God's miracles. There are some really extraordinary aspects of Hanukkah, much of which we learn about from 1 Maccabees. But none of that is what the Gemara says, right? What does the Gemara say? My Chanukah. What is Chanukah? Why are we celebrating Chanukah? Tanu Rabbanan, B'Kafhei Kislev, Yomi de Chanukah Tamanaya, right? We have 8 days of Hanukkah, starting with the 25th day of Kislev. Inun, that we have that. Delo l'mispad, we're not allowed to eulogize on those days. Lo l'mispad be'on, udelo l'hitanot be'on, we can't fast on those days. Why? Shekshenichnesu Yevanim lahechal, because when the Greeks came into the temple, tim'u kol hashmanim sheba'echal, they rendered all of the different oils in the temple impure. Ukshegavra malchut beit Chashmonai v'nitzchum, and here's the sort of peripheral reference to their extraordinary military victories. When the house of the Chashmonaim were successful and victorious in war, badku v'lo matzu el pach echad shel shemen shehaya munach bechotamo shel kohen gadol. They only found one pure flask of oil that still had the stamp of the Kohen Gadol on it. And it was enough to light just for one day, right? We all know this story. And there was a great miracle, and that oil lasted them for 8 days. And so we celebrate these 8 days. So there are several, obviously, curious things about this Gemara, starting with the fact that that's the miracle. There are so many great miracles of Hanukkah. None of that comes up here in the Gemara in Shabbat. Instead, we focus on this small flask of oil and the miracle that the oil lasts. What is the Gemara saying to us here? What is the Gemara focusing our attention on? So I want to answer by asking another question. Go back to Chagai for a second. Chagai tells us that, or tells the people, that they're meant to start building the Beit HaMikdash, the second temple, on the 25th day of Kislev, which is really odd because of the question that I asked you before I actually began this year, which is, how's the weather in Chicago? Right? How's the weather in Chicago? So I know Chicago's not Israel, but I can tell you today it rained until 2:00. And yesterday it was stormy. I mean, it was really pouring yesterday. So why would we start a building project in the middle of the winter? Right? It's a very odd time to start a building project. And that, I think, is a really kind of intriguing question, one that we have to address. I mean, aside from the fact that the conditions aren't really great for the construction workers, I think in addition to that, you're going to bring the wood and you're gathering it and it's lying outside. What are you going to cover it every night? Right? It's going to start to rot. So so the idea of starting a construction project at the end of Kislev really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, one thing that Rav Yael Bin points out, and here's my picture of a wintry Israel. One thing that Rav Yael Bin points out is that actually we have a Mishnah in Bikurim which mentions Chanukah, right? And the Mishnah tells us that, what is the Bikurim? The Bikurim is the bringing of the first fruits, right? So when do we bring the first fruits? During the harvest season, right? So the Mishnah tells us that we bring the first fruits me'atzeret ve'ad hachag, from Shavuot until Sukkot. Now, if you bring the first fruits from Sukkot, min hachag ve'ad Chanukah, mevi ve'eno koreh. You can bring, but you can't say the passage that we say when we bring the Bikurim, the passage from Devarim Perek Kavav. But Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says, no. Until Chanukah, you can still bring the first fruits. Why? Because the olive harvest doesn't end until Chanukah. In other words, most of the harvests really are concluded by Sukkot, but the olive harvest, well, that continues until Chanukah. And as we are gathering in our olive oil, right, we are also experiencing the darkest nights of the year, right? The darkest nights of the year take place during Hanukkah, right? Both the solar year and the lunar year, right? It's the solar solstice, I think I pronounced that right? It's the time when the days are shortest. And of course, the lunar calendar as well. From the 25th of the month, the moon is getting smaller and smaller. So we're talking about the shortest nights of the year with the least amount of moonlight in the year, and the days are getting darker and darker. And during this time, we are bringing in our olives, right? So the olive oil is somehow connected to Hanukkah. And of course, Hanukkah is also called the festival of lights, right? We say in Hebrew, Chag Urim. You know, that phrase doesn't appear in the book of Maccabees, and it actually doesn't even appear in the Gemara. I believe the earliest place where it appears is in Josephus, who's 1st century CE, but Josephus, of course, is a member of a very active and very respected member of the rabbinic circles in the land of Israel right before the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. So if he says that we're calling this festival the Festival of Lights, very likely he is reflecting what a lot of people called it. In other words, this holiday of lights is meant to bring light into the darkest days of the year. Okay, I think that we're going to rethink a little bit why Haggai tells them to start building the Beit HaMikdash at this darkest time of year. We're going to rethink that in a few minutes. But first, I want to suggest that the story of Hanukkah, which is the story of bringing light into darkness, is actually maybe the most important story in Tanakh, or if not the most important, perhaps the most foundational story in Tanakh. How does the Torah begin? The Torah begins with a world that is chaotic, a world that is described as tohu vavohu. It is a world of chaos, and it is a very dark world. Choshech al pnei tehom. The darkness is hovering over the abyss. And God says, Yehi or. When you have darkness, you have to bring in the light. That's the goal of the Torah. That's the goal, that's the purpose of creation. And I think Hanukkah is meant to symbolize this kind of yearly experience of bringing light into darkness. Obviously, we're talking about both in an actual sense, but more importantly, in a symbolic way. What is this light? What is the darkness? The darkness is chaos. The darkness is evil. The darkness is the opposite of the good that God brings in creation. Don't forget that in Bereshit, Perek Aleph, the key word is tov, is good. And the first thing that is good is the light that dispels the darkness. And then God creates a very good world. The word tov is a key word of that first chapter of creation. It appears 7 times. What is good? Well, the vegetation is good, and the heavenly bodies are good, and the fish and the birds and the animals are good, and the light is good. There's only one creature that God creates, which is not good, and that is humans. Humans are not said to be good, because humans have the option to live in a world of darkness or to bring light into that darkness. That, I think, is one of the ideas of the very first chapter in the book. And actually, there's an interesting Gemara, which I think seems to hint to this idea. There's Gemara in Masechet Avodah Zarah, and the Gemara here is it's the context of the Gemara is discussing actually the pagan holidays, and particularly in this context, the pagan holiday that is celebrated at this time of year in the deepest part of the winter. And the Gemara in Avodah Zarah says, well, why do we celebrate this time? Tanu Rabbanan, look at this story. We celebrate this from the time of Adam, from Adam Harishon. Lefi shera'a Adam Harishon, because in that first winter of Adam's life, he saw Yom Shemitma'et Veholech. He saw a day that was waning and becoming darker. Amar, and becoming shorter. Each day was becoming shorter. Amar, oily, woe to me. Shema bishvil shesarachti. Olam chashuch ba'adi. Maybe it is because I have sinned that the world is darkening around me. Can you imagine how frightening this must have been for Adam Harishon when he realizes that every day he has less and less light and the day seems to be plunging into darkness? What does he think? He thinks the days are getting shorter. God is returning us to chaos and darkness. V'chozer l'tohu vavohu. V'zohi mita sheniknesa alai mina shamayim. This is the death that God punished me with because I sinned and I ate from the tree of knowledge of good and bad, and therefore God is plunging the world back into darkness. Amad v'yashav chet yamim b'ta'anit u'b'tfilah. He fasted and he prayed for 8 days. In other words, he brought light into the world for 8 days. Kevan shera'at kufat tevet. And he then went into the month of Tevet. V'ra'a yom shema'arich v'holech. And he saw that the days were getting longer. Amar, and he said, Min hago shel olamhu. This is the way of the world. Every year we will be plunged into darkness and we will emerge once again into light. And of course, because of this, he makes a chag that is 8 days. Look at how the language of the Gemara, which describes this experience of Adam HaRishon, matches the language of the only Gemara which talks about Hanukkah. Okay, this Gemara never mentions Hanukkah, but it's obvious that this Gemara is talking about Hanukkah as well. And so both of the Gemaras, which talk about this 8-day holiday, relate to the problem of darkness, to the need to bring light into the world, that we have these 8 days of the deepest darkness of the year, where we are meant to go and light candles, where we are meant to understand that the miracle of the day is that we can bring light into a dark world, that we can bring purity into a world that has been suffused with impurity. These, I think, are very symbolic ideas, ones that appear in many different midrashic contexts. I brought for you here a midrash from the very beginning of Bereshit, from the pasuk, which tells us that the world was in darkness, and God says, Yehi or. How does the midrash explain that moment? Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ad mata yeheh ha'olam mitnaheg ba'afeilah. Until when will this world be shrouded in darkness? Tavo ha'ora, bring the light already. Vayomer Elokim yehi or. And God said, let there be light. What is that light that God brings? Ze Avraham. That is Avram. God creates a nation to bring light into a world of darkness. Vayikra Elohim la'or yom, and God calls the light day, ze Yaakov. That is Yaakov. V'lachoshech kara laila, but there still is darkness in the world, ze Esav. We're not talking about any ethnic group. We're talking about what Esav represents. In other words, when Adam HaRishon says, oh, it's not because I sinned that darkness is falling on the world, that the days are getting shorter and shorter. It's because that's the way of the world. The world is filled with forces of light and forces of darkness. And when God chooses Abraham to found a nation, he chooses Abraham to battle the forces of darkness. The darkness of the period of the winter is a symbol. It's symbolic of the darkness that exists in the world. And the command that Am Yisrael should bring light into the world is somehow symbolized by the lighting of the menorah on Hanukkah. Now, I think that this, I'm going to bring for you another midrash, which is also based on those first psukim in Sefer Bereshit, but this midrash specifically relates to the purpose of building the Beit HaMikdash. This midrash tells us, mitchilat briato shel olam, from the very beginning of the creation of the world, Safa HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Beit HaMikdash, banui v'charev v'banui. God saw that the Beit HaMikdash would be built and destroyed and rebuilt, that the world would sometimes have light and sometimes have darkness. And this is the way. Oh, hi, Malka. I see you on my screen. Welcome. And this is the way that the Midrash explains the first psukim in Sefer Bereshit. Bereshit bara Elokim, when God first created the world, this is a symbol of the building of the Beit HaMikdash. But then the world is plunged into darkness, into chaos. That's a symbol of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or. And when God says, let there be light, he is describing the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash. This is, I think, what the Maccabees think that they're doing. They are building, they are building the Beit HaMikdash in order to bring light into a world of darkness. This is, Yeshayahu talks about this all the time, about how Am Yisrael is meant to be le'or goyim, as a light to nations. I brought for you at the bottom of this screen a less well-known citation from Yeshayahu, from Yeshayahu Perek Tet, Ha'am ha'olchim b'choshech, this nation that walks in a world of darkness, Ra'u or Gadol, they've seen this great light. And I think this is the reason that when the Maccabees are basing themselves on the prophecies of Chagai and Zechariah, and when we celebrate Hanukkah, we turn to the prophecies of Chagai and Zechariah, and particularly, as I noted, we read as the Haftarah of Shabbat Hanukkah, this prophecy of Zechariah. I will just say one thing about Zechariah, and that is that unlike Chagai, who says it like it is, he gets up and he says, just build the Beit HaMikdash, go up to the mountain and cut down a tree and build the Beit HaMikdash. Zechariah says things in a little bit of a more elliptical fashion, and he actually brings for us all of these different visions that he has, and these visions posit picture of rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash and rebuilding the world around the Beit HaMikdash. But the part that is significant for our purposes is that this parak in Zechariah is the middle vision. It's the linchpin. It's the goal. It's his most profound vision. It's his reason for building the Beit HaMikdash. What is the reason that Zechariah wants us to build the Beit HaMikdash? So that we can rebuild the menorah, right? He sees at the center of all of his visions of rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash, he sees a menorah. And on either side of the menorah, he sees these olive trees that are feeding the oil into the menorah so that the menorah can shine light on the world. Okay, it's interesting because, of course, the Beit HaMikdash has several very significant kelim, several very significant vessels, and at different times in history, perhaps we're more interested in the function of different vessels. I think we are aware that David was very attached to the Aron. The Aron, which represented God's presence in the Mikdash, right? David was very attached to God, and he was very attached to the Aron, which bears the presence of God. Unlike David, Shlomo, his son, seems to really focus on the Mizbeach, on the altar, on what it means to bring sacrifices, what it means to serve God. These are kind of two different perspectives. During the period of Shivat Zion, when Zechariah is describing the rebuilding of the temple, he focuses on the menorah. And he says, I think that there's a lot of symbolism of this menorah. Certainly we have the symbolism of the two olive trees, which represent the two leaders during this period. We have the symbolism, of course, of the light of God's presence. We also have ultimately the explanation of the angel who is showing Zechariah this vision, and he explains, Lo v'chayil v'lo v'choach ki im beruchi amar Hashem tzvaot. His message is, Lo v'chayil doesn't mean you won't wage war and you won't use your power, but you won't primarily be waging war. You won't only, lo rak b'chayil, you won't only be engaged in warfare, and you won't only be engaged in using your strength, but primarily you are doing this in order to bring the presence of God. right? It goes back to Bereshit Perek Aleph, where we have a world of tohu vavohu, a world of chaos, a world of darkness. V'ruach Elokim merachefet al pnei hamayim. We have the presence of God, and that presence of God is designed to bring light. This is a very important message for the Maccabees in particular, right? Because the Maccabees are very focused on their military victories, and rightly so. Their military victories are very important. They're very impressive, but they look to Haggai and Zechariah for inspiration. And so when Chazal asks the question, Mai Chanukah, what is Chanukah really about? They say, Lo b'chayil. It's not about the military victories. V'lo v'choach. It is about the menorah. It's about the light that we can shine on the world. Of course, I think it's of great significance that the symbol of Israel becomes this vision of Zechariah. I brought for you a picture of the menorah that is in the Knesset, right? The actual structure of the menorah, and of course, the symbol of Israel with the olive branches on either side. Many people assume that this is because Israel is a country that wants peace. That certainly is true. I think it's also because, or perhaps even primarily because of Zechariah's vision, where he says, we are the Tzva Hagana LiYisrael. We are the army that is a defensive army. Lo b'chayil v'lo b'koach. It's not about achieving power. It's not about using our power indiscriminately or to crush or subordinate others. Ultimately, it's about spreading the Ruach Hashem. That's the ultimate goal. That's the ultimate goal of Am Yisrael. That's the ultimate goal of Am Avraham, of the nation that comes from Avraham. It's to spread light in the world, and that's the ultimate goal of building the Beit HaMikdash. Ultimately, I think this point is made in what I think is a beautiful midrash, and with this, we're going to start to wind down. I'll take your questions if you have, but I think that there's a beautiful midrash that really expresses this. It's a midrash in Vayikra Rabbah, which is based on a pasuk in Melachim Aleph, which is describing the building of the first Beit HaMikdash. And in this pasuk, they describe the windows in the Mikdash. Okay, so and Mikdash needs windows. We don't want it to be dingy and dark inside. And so the Mikdash was built with windows. But look at how the Midrash describes the windows. The Midrash describes as follows: Shkufot atumot means hayu maktinot mibifnim. They were narrow inside. Umarchivot mibachutz, and the windows were wide facing outside. Why? Kidei lehotzi ora leolam, in order to bring the light of the Mikdash out to the world. The Midrash goes on and says, when people build a palace, when people build a home, usually they build the windows in such a way that the light is drawn from the outside into the dark inner areas of the house. But the Beit HaMikdash is the opposite. The Beit HaMikdash is designed to bring the light to the world at large. And that is the symbolism, I think, of the menorah. And that's the symbolism of Hanukkah. The symbolism of Hanukkah is that Am Yisrael is designated to be a nation that when it sees darkness, when it experiences darkness and cruelty and evil and immorality, we are designated, we're given the job to light the candles, to spread the morality of God. And the Beit HaMikdash becomes a symbol of this. In another Midrash, the Midrash asks the question, why in the desert do they set up the lights in the Mishkan? We have a constant Amud Ha'esh, a pillar of fire. We don't need the light of the Mishkan to guide us. And the Gemara answers, Edut hi liva'ei olam, shehashchina shora b'Yisrael. The light here is not just to spread God's morality, but also to shine on Am Yisrael, so that the whole world knows that God is resting his presence on Israel. So I'm going to conclude with this final pasuk from Sefer Yeshayahu, which, as I said, Sefer Yeshayahu is really, I think, very observes this idea and brings up this idea with great frequency in all sorts of different ways, that we have this nation that is meant to shine God's morality and God's light to the world at large. This is the purpose of Hanukkah, but it's also the purpose for creating Am Yisrael, as the Midrash said, Yehi Or Ze Avraham. This pasuk, which we'll conclude with, is a pasuk from Yeshayahu, Perek Samach. We read it as one of the haftarot of Nechama between Tisha B'Av and Rosh Hashanah. And Yeshayahu calls to Yerushalayim, he calls to Am Yisrael, and he says, Kumi, Ori, get up, shine your light, Kiva Orech, for your light has come, Uchvod Hashem, Alayich Zarach, and the glory of God shines upon you. Because darkness is covering, is shrouding the earth. The Arafel Le'umim and the nations are shrouded in fog. These are, of course, metaphors for the confusion and the lack of moral clarity that is being described here among the nations. But Alayich Yizrach Hashem, Uchvodo Alayich Yira'eh. God will shine his morality on you, and your task is Ki mitzion tetzei Torah, that the instruction of God, the morality of God, the light of God should go out from Yerushalayim, the halchu goyim leorech, and other nations should walk by your light, umelachim lenoga zarchech, and kings should walk by the shine of your light. And with this, we will conclude. I conclude once again with tefillot for Bisorot Tovot, for the success of our Chayalim, and for the success of Am Yisrael, for the refuah, for the health of all of those who've been wounded, and of course for the return, the safe return of all of those who have been taken hostage. I'm happy to take questions. In fact, I'll stop sharing so that I can see you all. I also see that there are a couple chats here. Some nice thank yous, but no questions so far. I'm happy to hear questions. Just unmute yourselves or comments.
Thank you. You contrasted the Gemara in Avodah Zarah about Adam Arishon, whose discovery there is Olam Kamin Hago No Heg, versus the other Gemara in Shabbos, right, where there's an emphasis on Nes. Do you want to? Is there anything to expand? I mean, those are two different types of religious consciousness. Of how, obviously, you know that. I'm not saying you don't know. Of how the world functions, of how we view the world, about expectations of miracles, and the role of light. So, is there something going on there? I'm just curious about that.
It's an interesting observation. I wasn't really thinking so much in that direction. I was more viewing them as complementary. In other words, Adam Arishon is discovering that the world is always going to have movements upward and downward in terms of darkness and evil, and that is certainly true. I mean, that is certainly something that we see. And the Gemara in Shabbos is noting that sometimes we need God in order to be able to bring light properly, because the world is so steeped in impurity that we need the Ruach Elokim merachefet al pnei hamayim, right? We need that hovering presence of God in order to make sure that we can bring the light. The light is not something, I could bring lots of examples, which I don't think that any of you need me to bring these examples of, how hard it is to bring light into darkness, right? I mean, how many times do you have to say a lie before people begin to accept it as truth? Sometimes we really need siyata dishmaya. We need a miracle just to be able to light the candle, right? It seems like such an insignificant miracle. So I was really looking at those two Gemaras as complementary. I certainly see what you're suggesting here, and that's an interesting suggestion, but I don't have anywhere really to go with that at the moment, but it's something that I'll definitely, keep it in mind. It's an interesting contrast. Okay, so I'll take this opportunity to wish everybody a Chanukah Sameach.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ziegler. This was fantastic. I don't think any of us are going to look at the date of Hanukkah the same way, let alone all the other Torah that you shared, which was really, really beautiful. Thank you everyone for being with us and sharing a little Torah and a little light, and may it be a Hanukkah where the Jewish people brings a lot of light to the world. And if you'd like to join us next week, Thursday at noon, we'll have more Torah from Judy Klitzner. So we'll see everyone then. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.